4 years old. That's how young he was when someone beat him to death and left his naked body floating in a Virginia creek. For 53 years, nobody knew his name. He was just John Doe, a little boy erased from existence, until 2025, when a few millimeters of hair, preserved since 1972, whispered his identity back into the world. Welcome to Criminal Minds Archives. I'm your host, and what you're about to hear isn't fiction. These are 5 real cold cases, decades old, seemingly unsolvable, that were finally cracked in 2025. Not through confession, not through witnesses stepping forward, but through the silent testimony of DNA traced through family trees across generations, connecting the dots between the living and the dead. In 1972, genetic genealogy didn't exist. DNA profiling was science fiction. The Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, wouldn't launch for another quarter century. Detectives had photographs, fingerprints, and witness statements. When those failed, cases went cold. Families waited, decades passed, memories faded, hope died. But in 2025, forensic science did what seemed impossible. Using cutting-edge genetic genealogy technology, investigators breathed new life into investigations that had been frozen for 20, 30, even 50 years. They identified murder victims who'd been buried as Jane and John Does. They caught killers who thought they'd gotten away with it. These aren't just statistics. They're stories of children who never came home, mothers who vanished without a trace, women whose lives were stolen in moments of violence, and families who waited generations for one word: closure. From a 4-year-old boy murdered on a highway in 1972, to a pregnant woman strangled in a Toronto parking lot in 1998, to remains that lay unidentified in shallow graves for nearly half a century. These cases show us that time doesn't erase truth, it only delays it. The technology that solved these cases reads the genetic code written into our bones, preserved in teeth, saved in strands of hair. It builds family trees from DNA matches, connecting distant cousins who've uploaded their genetic data to genealogy databases, never knowing they might hold the key to solving a murder. This is the power of genetic genealogy, and in 2025, it brought 5 families the answers they'd been praying for. Let's begin with a case that would haunt investigators for more than 5 decades. A case that started with a teenager's horrifying discovery on a summer morning in 1972. June 13, 1972. Lorton, Virginia. A humid summer morning in the suburbs of Fairfax County, just miles from the nation's capital. A local teenager was exploring near Massey Creek, under the old Colchester Road Bridge, when he saw something in the water. Something small. Something that shouldn't be there. It was the body of a child. The little boy was floating face down in the shallow creek. He was naked, unclothed. No identification, no shoes, no belongings. Nothing that could tell investigators who he was or where he came from. The medical examiner's findings were devastating. This child had died from blunt force trauma to the head. Brutal, repeated blows that ended his young life. The murder had happened less than 24 hours before his body was discovered. Somewhere nearby, someone had beaten this boy to death, stripped him, and thrown him into the creek like garbage. Investigators estimated he was between 3 and 6 years old. He had black hair, brown eyes, stood about 3 feet 9 inches tall, and weighed approximately 50 pounds. He'd been circumcised, a detail that suggested a family that had access to medical care. Someone out there should have been looking for him. But no one came forward. The Fairfax County Police Department launched an intensive investigation. They checked missing children reports. They distributed his description. They created composite sketches. Nothing. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, years into decades. The boy remained unidentified. Local social organization, the Charlettes, took pity on the nameless child. They buried him and named him Charles Lee Charlotte. But that wasn't his real name. It was just another placeholder, another label for a boy no one could identify. In death, as in his final moments, he was alone. Detectives refused to give up. In 2004, they used facial reconstruction software to create an image, of what the boy might have looked like when he was alive. The FBI developed a DNA profile from a few hairs used in the 1972 autopsy, but database searches came up empty. The case remained cold. Detective Melissa Wallace would later take ownership of the case, driven by a personal connection. "I have my own son," she said. To see the extent of that boy's injuries and what he had suffered through, she couldn't let it go. By 2021, only the final traces of testable hair remained. This was it, the last chance. Detectives sent those precious millimeters to Astrea Forensics in California for advanced DNA testing. The lab normally required 2 centimeters of hair for analysis. Detective Wallace didn't even know if she had 2 millimeters, but Astrea Forensics agreed to try. Against all odds, they succeeded. From those few millimeters of half-century-old hair, they extracted enough DNA to create a profile suitable for genetic genealogy. This profile was sent to Innovative Forensic Investigations, a private investigation company specializing in forensic genealogy. The genealogists got to work, comparing the boy's DNA to samples in public genealogy databases. They were looking for relatives, anyone whose DNA showed they were connected to this child. After extensive research, they found a possible match. The DNA pointed to a family in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. With help from the Philadelphia Police Department, detectives made contact with relatives. They discovered something heartbreaking. A woman named Vera Bryant had once had 2 sons, Carl and James. In 1972, she told family she was traveling from Philadelphia to Virginia with her boyfriend, James Hedgepeth. She'd taken her 2 boys with her. They never returned. Vera Bryant had died in 1980. She'd never reconnected with her family in Philadelphia after that 1972 trip. Her sons had simply vanished. Family members assumed that they'd been placed somewhere, maybe with relatives of Hedgepeth, but no one knew for sure. Detectives obtained Vera Bryant's death records and birth certificates for her sons. Then they made an extraordinary decision. They exhumed Vera Bryant's body. A Nashville George Mason University helped prepare the evidence for submission to Astrea Forensics. Multiple attempts failed due to preservation issues with Vera's remains. But in April 2025, 53 years after that little boy was pulled from the creek, Astrea Forensics successfully extracted DNA from a portion of Vera Bryant's remains. The comparison was made. On July 1st, 2025, the results came back positive. John Lorton Doe. 1972 had a name, Carl Matthew Bryant, born May 26, 1968. He was 4 years old when he died, just weeks after his 4th birthday. At a press conference on August 4th, 2025, Fairfax County Police Chief Kevin Davis announced the breakthrough. Carl's cousins stood alongside the detectives. His aunt sat in the audience, too overwhelmed to speak. They'd searched for answers for decades. They wondered what happened to Carl and his mother. Now they knew. But the story didn't end with Carl's identification. It opened a new, even darker chapter. Detectives believed that Vera Bryant's boyfriend, James Hedgepeth, was responsible for Carl's death. Hedgepeth had a violent history. He'd already served time for murder before he started dating Vera Bryant. He died years ago, escaping justice. Investigators also believed Vera Bryant was complicit in her own son's murder, or at least she'd known what happened and covered it up. She died in 1980, taking whatever she knew to the grave. But there was another victim. Carl's younger brother, James Bryant, was only 6 months old in June 1972. He disappeared the same day Carl died. Police believe James Hedgepeth killed both boys, the 4-year-old and the infant, somewhere between Philadelphia and Middlesex County, Virginia. They believe James Bryant's body is still out there, dumped along that route, waiting to be found. Detectives are now appealing to the public. If you remember Vera Bryant or James Hedgepeth from 1972, if you lived along Highway 95 between Philadelphia and Virginia, if you know of any unidentified infant remains from that era, they need to hear from you. Carl Matthew Bryant has his name back. His gravestone will finally bear his true identity, but his baby brother is still lost, and the full truth of what happened on June 13, 1972 may never be known. Detective Melissa Wallace said it best. He can finally have his name, a gravestone, and his family can have some semblance of closure. After 53 years, Carl Bryant is no longer John Doe. He's a little boy who was loved, who was missed, and who is finally home. But Carl's case is just one example of how genetic genealogy cracks seemingly impossible mysteries in 2025. Our next case takes us from Virginia to Tennessee and a double murder that haunted investigators for nearly 4 decades. Sometimes the answers we seek are buried deeper than we can imagine, literally. November 7, 1987. Charlotte Avenue, Nashville, Tennessee. A house that looks like any other on the street holds a horror beneath its foundation. In the dirt floor basement, investigators are digging. What they find will haunt them for nearly 4 decades. 2 shallow graves. 2 women, both murdered, both unidentified. The house belonged to a man named James Mitchell Schaffer, and Schaffer was already behind bars in Kentucky, serving time for kidnapping and raping a 14-year-old boy. When confronted about the bodies in his basement, Schaffer didn't deny it. He confessed. He told investigators he'd killed both women in 1985, 2 years before their remains were discovered. He claimed they were sex workers. He said he'd picked them up on the streets of Nashville. He only knew them by their street names, Sheila and Lil Bit. According to Schaffer's confession, he'd met the woman called Sheila Cummings on April 21, 1984, near Broadway and 4th Avenue North in downtown Nashville. He brought her back to his house on Charlotte Avenue. At some point, he caught her taking money from his wallet. Rage took over. He struck her in the head with a rubber mallet. Then he stabbed her multiple times. When she was dead, he dismembered her body and buried the pieces in the dirt basement beneath his house. The second woman, the one he called Lil Bit, he met on July 4, 1985, around 12th Avenue North and Jefferson Street. He brought her to the same house. This time, he strangled her. Then he buried her next to Sheila. For 2 years, Schaffer lived in that house with 2 corpses decomposing beneath his feet. He'd kidnapped and assaulted another sex worker in July 1985, holding her captive for over 24 hours before she managed to escape. That woman's testimony helped put Schaffer away, but she had no idea about the 2 women who hadn't escaped. When investigators excavated the basement in 1987, they found skeletal remains. The first woman, the one Schaffer called Sheila, was buried wearing a blonde wig, red and black high-heel shoes, corduroy jeans, and a blouse. She wore a gold-braided ring with an amber stone on her finger. On her wrist was an Elgin gold watch. Her fingernails and toenails were painted red and yellow. She was estimated to be between 20 and 40 years old, about 5 feet 8 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, with black hair. The second woman, Lil Bit, was also skeletal. Schaffer thought her last name might have been Johnson, but he wasn't sure. Just like Sheila, she couldn't be identified. Detectives tried everything available in 1987. They had no fingerprints. The bodies were too decomposed. They had no dental records to match. They had names that might be aliases. They had a killer who'd confessed but couldn't provide real identities. The case stalled. For nearly 40 years, these 2 women lay in unmarked graves, their families unaware of what had happened to them. Somewhere, people were searching. Somewhere, mothers and daughters were missing, but the connection couldn't be made. Enter Detective Matt Filter in the Metro Nashville Police Department's Cold Case Unit. By 2025, forensic technology had evolved beyond anything imaginable in 1987. The FBI's CODIS database, the Combined DNA Index System, didn't even exist when these women were found. In January 2025, Detective Filter made a decision: exhume both bodies and extract DNA for contemporary forensic analysis. The women's remains were disinterred. DNA samples were carefully collected and prepared for genetic genealogy testing. Filter's goal was to build family trees from their DNA, tracing distant relatives who might have uploaded their genetic information to public genealogy databases. But just 2 days before those DNA samples were supposed to be collected, something extraordinary happened. A woman was browsing the internet when she came across information about the Nashville Cold Case Unit's investigation. The Metro Police had publicized their renewed efforts, including releasing a new forensic rendering of the woman known as Lil Bit in April 2025. But it was the information about Sheila that caught this woman's attention. The details matched, the time frame matched, the location matched. she picked up the phone and called the cold case unit. She told them her mother had been missing since 1984. Her mother's name was Sheila Cummings. She was from Elgin, Illinois. She'd last been known to be in Tennessee. She'd been driving a specific car, details that matched information police had but hadn't released publicly. The woman had been searching for her mother for 40 years. She and her sister had grown up without answers. Now they provided DNA samples for comparison. On Wednesday, July 2nd, 2025, the results came back. Confirmed match. The woman buried in the basement of James Schaffer's house on Charlotte Avenue was Sheila Cummings. Not an alias, not a street name, her real name. She was 23 years old when James Schaffer murdered her. She had daughters who'd been searching for her since childhood. She had a family in Elgin, Illinois, who never stopped wondering what happened to her. At a press conference, Detective Filter addressed the breakthrough. "It's a great feeling to know after 40 years, you're able to finally identify somebody and return them to their family," he said. "You've got some people, like with Sheila Cummings, they've been looking for their mother for 40 years and never could find anything. Then they just finally found something on the internet regarding her case and were able to get their mother returned to them. The timing was almost miraculous. If Sheila's daughter had called just days later, the exhumation would have already been underway. The identification would have taken months instead of weeks. But she called at exactly the right moment, as if some force was guiding her to her mother after 4 decades of separation." But the story isn't complete. The second woman, Lil Bit, remains unidentified. Her DNA has been entered into CODIS. A forensic rendering of what she might have looked like has been released to the public. Genealogists are working to build her family tree. But as of today, she's still Jane Doe. Still waiting for someone to recognize her. Still waiting for her daughters or sisters or mother to come forward and say, "That's her. That's my Lil Bit." Detective Filter won't give up. "The technology that solved Sheila's case," he said, "we hope will one day give another family the answers they've been waiting for." James Schaffer confessed to these murders decades ago. He's been held accountable. But for Sheila Cummings' daughters, justice isn't just about punishing the killer. It's about knowing. It's about being able to visit their mother's grave and say her real name. It's about ending 40 years of not knowing. And for Lil Bit's family, whoever they are, wherever they are, that moment is still coming. Because genetic genealogy doesn't forget. It doesn't give up. It waits, patient as the DNA itself, for the connection that will finally bring her home. From the basement of a Nashville house to the cold pavement of a Toronto parking lot, from a killer who confessed decades ago to one who thought he'd vanished into the crowd. Our next case proves that genetic genealogy isn't just identifying the dead, it's hunting the living. March 8, 1998. Toronto, Ontario. A crisp early morning in Canada's largest city. At 130 Carlton Street near Jarvis Street in the downtown core, a concerned resident walks through a rear parking lot. What they find stops them cold. A woman's body, lying motionless. Obvious signs of trauma. She's been strangled to death. The victim is identified quickly. Donna Oglive, 24 years old, originally from British Columbia and of Filipino descent. She'd been in Toronto for only 5 weeks, working in the sex trade to support herself. But there's something even more tragic. Donna Oglive was 4 months pregnant. Detective Sergeant Steve Smith would later tell reporters, "It looks like it may have been a sex trade transaction, and it ended in the death of Miss Oglive. She'd met a client. She'd gone with him to that parking lot, and she'd never made it out alive. Neither did her unborn child." Investigators collected evidence from the scene, including male DNA, presumably from her killer. They ran it through every database available. No match. They interviewed witnesses, followed leads, distributed information. The case consumed resources and manpower, but without a suspect, without a name, the investigation eventually went cold. Donna Oglive was buried. Her family mourned. Her other child, the one who'd survived, grew up without a mother. And somewhere in Canada, a man who'd strangled a pregnant woman to death walked free, believing he'd gotten away with it. Years passed. Decades passed. The Toronto Police Service's Homicide and Missing Persons Unit never closed the file. but they had nowhere left to turn. In December 2019, they released a YouTube video appealing for information. In October 2021, the case was featured on 24 Shades of Blue, a Toronto police podcast highlighting unsolved homicides. Still nothing. 26 years. That's how long Donna Oglive waited for justice. In 2022, the Toronto Police Service made a decision that would change everything. They sent forensic evidence, including that male DNA profile from the crime scene, to Othram Laboratories in the Woodlands, Texas. Othram specializes in something called forensic-grade genome sequencing. It's a cutting-edge technology that can build comprehensive DNA profiles even from degraded or limited samples. Scientists at Othram worked meticulously on the evidence. They extracted genetic material, they sequenced it, they built a complete profile suitable for genetic genealogy analysis. Then they sent it back to Toronto. The Toronto police took that DNA profile and began a forensic genetic genealogy search. They uploaded the data to genealogy databases, where millions of people have shared their DNA to learn about their ancestry. The computer algorithms went to work comparing segments of DNA, looking for matches, not to the killer himself, but to his relatives. Second cousins, third cousins. Anyone whose genetic code showed they shared a common ancestor with the man who'd killed Donna Oglive. The search generated new investigative leads, real names, real families, real addresses. Genealogists began building family trees, working backward through generations, narrowing down the possibilities. Who in this family would have been in Toronto in 1998? Who would have been the right age? Who had the means and opportunity? The investigation led them to Newfoundland, to a man named Ronald Gordon Ackerman. In 1998, Ronald Ackerman was living in Scarborough, a district of Toronto. He was working as a truck driver. He was in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to have been Donna Oglive's killer. Investigators obtained a DNA sample from Ackerman for comparison. The match was positive. But there was a complication. By 2025, Ronald Ackerman no longer lived in Toronto. He'd moved to Gander, Newfoundland, on Canada's east coast, and he wasn't staying there full-time either. He was working in the oil fields of northern Alberta, spending 2 weeks at a time in the remote camps before flying back east for 2 weeks off. He was constantly moving, always in transit. Toronto police coordinated with law enforcement agencies across Canada, the Edmonton Police Service, the Calgary Police Service, the Alberta RCMP, and the Newfoundland and Labrador RCMP. They tracked Ackerman's movements. They studied his schedule. They waited for the perfect moment. That moment came on February 6, 2025, just after midnight. Ronald Gordon. Ackerman, 50 years old, stepped off a flight from Edmonton at Toronto Pearson International Airport. He was heading home to Newfoundland after 2 weeks in the oil fields. He thought he was just passing through. Instead, he was met by Toronto police detectives. He was placed under arrest for first-degree murder in the death of Donna Oglive, a crime committed 26 years, 11 months, and 29 days earlier. At a press conference the following day, Detective Sergeant Steve Smith made the announcement. For 26 years, investigators have remained committed to seeking justice for Donna and her loved ones, he said. Advances in forensic technology, along with the unwavering dedication of our team and investigative partners, have led us to this arrest, Smith continued. Our thoughts remain with Donna's family and friends, who have endured decades of grief and unanswered questions. No matter how much time passes, we do not give up on victims of homicide. Ronald Ackerman appeared via video link at the Toronto Regional Bail Center and was remanded into custody, where he remains as he awaits trial. But the investigation isn't over. Detective Smith told reporters that Toronto police are now working to piece together Ackerman's movements over the past 2 decades. They're cross-referencing his whereabouts with unsolved sexual assaults and homicides across Canada. We need to find out what he's been doing over the past 25 years, Smith said, to make sure that there are no other victims, whether sexually motivated or homicides, that he could be involved in. The message from Toronto police is clear. Genetic genealogy has changed the game. Anybody that committed sexual assaults or homicides over the past 40, 50 years, Smith said, if they're still alive, they'd be expecting a knock on their door at any point. For Donna Oglive's family, the arrest brings a mixture of relief and renewed pain. Justice delayed is not justice denied, but it's still decades too late. Donna's child grew up without a mother. Her family spent 26 years wondering if her killer would ever be caught. Now they know his name. Now they know he'll face trial. And for pregnant Donna, who was just 24 years old and trying to survive in a difficult world, her death is no longer an unsolved mystery. She's no longer just a statistic. She's a woman whose life mattered, whose murder was not forgotten, and whose killer finally has to answer for what he did. Genealogy gave Donna Oglive her voice back, and it sent a message to every cold case killer in North America. Time is not on your side anymore. The DNA you left behind is waiting. And one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe in 10 years, it will lead investigators straight to your door. We're halfway through our journey into the case's genealogy solved in 2025. 2 more stories remain, and each one proves that no matter how much time passes, the truth is written into our very bones, waiting to be read. Sometimes a family trip becomes a journey into darkness. And sometimes the truth waits nearly half a century before it rises from a Florida forest. December 1980. Fountain, Florida. The woods west of Highway 231 are quiet, untouched, perfect hunting grounds. 3 hunters are making their way through the underbrush when they see something that stops them cold. A shallow grave, partially exposed, and skeletal remains. The bones of a woman who'd been buried here, left to decompose under Florida pines. Some of her bones had been scattered by wildlife. Her clothing was damaged in ways that suggested violence. This was no natural death. This was murder. Investigators from the Bay County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene. They carefully excavated the remains and sent them to the Florida State University Anthropology Lab for examination. The forensic anthropologists worked meticulously, trying to determine who this woman was and what had happened to her. At the time, there was another missing woman case that had been haunting Bay County. Joanne Benner had vanished in 1976. Her body had never been found. When the remains were discovered in 1980, investigators hoped, in a grim way, that they'd finally found Joanne Benner, that her family would finally have closure. But the anthropologists ruled it out. Joanne Benner had suffered specific injuries in life, injuries that would have left marks on her skeleton. This woman's bones showed no such trauma. She wasn't Joanne Benner. So who was she? The FSU team tried everything available in 1980, but DNA profiling didn't exist yet. Genetic genealogy was decades away from being invented. The woman's identity remained a mystery. She was buried as a Jane Doe, and her case went cold. For 45 years, she lay in an unmarked grave while somewhere, people wondered what had happened to her. Somewhere, siblings were searching. Somewhere, parents had died without ever knowing what became of their daughter. But Bay County Sheriff's Office never gave up. Their cold case unit, a dedicated team of retired and active investigators, periodically reviewed unsolved cases, looking for opportunities where new technology might provide answers. In 2024, they turned their attention back to the mysterious woman in the shallow grave. Working with the crime scene unit, they devised a plan. They obtained a tooth from the woman's remains, one of the most reliable sources of DNA and skeletal remains, and submitted it to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for DNA profiling. FDLE succeeded in extracting a profile and entered it into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. And CODIS found a match. 2 matches, actually. 2 people in Texas had previously submitted their DNA to law enforcement because they had a sister who'd been missing since 1977. Their DNA showed they were closely related to the woman in the grave. The Center for Human Identification conducted a kinship analysis, a detailed comparison to determine the exact familial relationship. On June 27, 2025, the results were confirmed. The woman in the shallow grave was Carol Sue Skidmore, missing from Sealy, Texas since April 1977. At a press conference, Bay County Sheriff Tommy Ford made the announcement. "We will never stop seeking justice for victims of crime," he said, "no matter how much time may have passed." But Carol's identification opened a story even more tragic than anyone could have imagined. On March 29, 1977, Carol Skidmore, her husband James Ronald Skidmore, and their 5-year-old son Lynn Dale Mahaffey left their home in Sealy, Texas. The couple's marriage was troubled. They were making the trip to Rossville, Georgia, to visit James's parents. They were hoping the trip would help them put their marriage back together. Carol called her parents on April 9, 1977. She told them she wasn't sure when they'd be returning home. That was the last time her family ever heard from her. 4 weeks later, on May 1, 1977, a horrifying discovery was made in Tennessee. A child's body was found in Parksville Lake in the Cherokee National Forest. The boy had been wrapped in plastic and weighted down. He'd been in the water for weeks. Authorities conducted an investigation, trying to identify the child. In June 1977, the FBI confirmed what investigators feared. The body was Lindale Mahaffey, Carol Skidmore's 5-year-old son. He'd been murdered and dumped in a lake. 1 day later, June 1, 1977, James Ronald Skidmore was found dead in a hotel room in Harrison, Arkansas. He died from a drug overdose. Next to his body was a suicide note. It said simply, things weren't working out for him. Authorities searched for Carol. They believed she might be alive somewhere, running from the horror of what had happened. But she never surfaced. She was listed as missing. Her family searched for decades, never knowing if she'd been killed or if she'd disappeared by choice, traumatized by her son's murder and her husband's suicide. Now, in 2025, they finally had their answer. James Skidmore hadn't just killed himself. He'd murdered his wife. He'd murdered his 5-year-old stepson. He'd buried Carol's body in a shallow grave in Bay County, Florida. He'd dumped little Lynn's body in a Tennessee lake. Then he'd driven to Arkansas and ended his own life, taking the full truth with him. Investigators contacted Carol's surviving siblings. One of her siblings had already passed away, but her brother was still alive. When he received word that his sister had finally been found, he was grateful. Grateful to finally know what happened to her. Grateful to have closure after 48 years of not knowing. In August 2025, Carol's remains were returned to Texas. In September, she was finally laid to rest with her family, nearly 50 years after she left on that fateful trip to Georgia. For Carol's brother, who'd provided DNA years earlier when he reported his sister missing, the news brought both relief and renewed grief. His sister had been murdered, his nephew had been murdered, and the killer, the man who'd done this, had died in 1977, never facing justice for what he'd done. But at least now Carol was home. Her name had been restored. Her family could visit her grave and speak her name. The mystery that had haunted them for half a century was finally solved. Senior crime scene analyst Kaylin Aaron from the Bay County Sheriff's Office spoke about the case. "It holds a special place in my heart," she said, "being able to give that family closure after 45 years of not knowing where she's at." Sheriff Tommy Ford emphasized the commitment of his department. "We will never stop seeking justice for victims of crime, no matter how much time may have passed." And there's one more thing. Remember Joanne Benner, the woman investigators thought might be the remains found in 1980? Her case has progressed. New evidence has emerged. The cold case unit has turned her case over to the state attorney's office for review and potential prosecution. After decades, Joanne Benner's family may finally get justice too. Genetic Genealogy solved Carol Skidmore's case, and it's opening doors in cases that seem permanently closed. Sometimes a person vanishes, and their family searches for years, hoping for a phone call that never comes. And sometimes that person has been dead all along, lying in an unmarked grave, waiting for science to catch up with tragedy. January 13, 1977. Lee County, Arkansas. A farm field near U.S. Highway 79, just a few miles west of Marianna. The Arkansas Delta, flat, rural, endless fields of farmland. A farmer or field worker discovers something disturbing in the soil. Skeletal remains, human, male, no identification, no wallet, no personal effects. Just bones, partially buried, deteriorating in the Arkansas earth. Arkansas State Police Criminal Investigation Division responded. They collected the remains and submitted them to the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory Medical Examiner's Office. The forensic pathologists examined the skeleton carefully. They estimated the man was in his early 20s when he died, but they couldn't determine who he was, and they couldn't determine how he died. The cause and manner of death remained unknown. Investigators ran every test available in 1977. They checked missing persons reports. They distributed descriptions. They followed every lead they could find. Nothing. The case went cold. The man was buried as John Doe. His family, wherever they were, never knew he'd been found. For 47 years, he remained unidentified. His case file gathered dust in evidence storage. His family never stopped wondering, and somewhere the truth about how he ended up dead in that Arkansas farm field remained buried along with his bones. Then in March 2024, the Arkansas State Police Cold Case Unit made a decision. They would reopen the case using technology that hadn't existed in 1977. Advanced DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy. With assistance from the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory, the remains were carefully prepared and shipped to Othram Labs in the Woodlands, Texas. Othram is a private laboratory that specializes in something revolutionary: forensic-grade genome sequencing. They can extract DNA from bones that have been buried for decades. They can build comprehensive genetic profiles even when the samples are degraded or limited. Scientists at Othram went to work on the skeletal remains from the Arkansas farm field. They extracted genetic material. They sequenced it. They built a complete DNA profile suitable for forensic genetic genealogy. Then they ran that profile through genealogy databases, searching for relatives, anyone whose DNA showed they shared a common ancestor with this unidentified man. On June 6, 2025, 48 years after the remains were found, Othram delivered their report. They tentatively identified the man as Charles Howard Wallace, and they traced two possible relatives living in Tennessee. Investigators from Arkansas State Police traveled to Tennessee. In July 2025, they collected DNA samples from one of Wallace's living relatives. Othram conducted a kinship analysis, comparing the relative's DNA to the DNA from the skeletal remains. On September 2, 2025, the results came back. Positive match. The man in the Arkansas farm field was definitely Charles Howard Wallace. He would have been about 21 years old when he died. Arkansas State Police Colonel Mike Hagar made the announcement on September 5, 2025. This identification provides long overdue answers for the family, he said, and highlights the commitment of Arkansas State Police to ensuring no case is forgotten. But the identification raised more questions than it answered. Charles Howard. Wallace's family told investigators that the last time they'd seen him was in the fall of 1974 in Memphis, Tennessee. Charles had been struggling. He was in his late teens. He'd been seeking treatment at a halfway house in downtown Memphis, a facility for people dealing with addiction or mental health challenges. Then he disappeared. His family searched. They filed missing persons reports. They never heard from him again. For 50 years, they wondered what happened to Charles. Was he alive somewhere? Living under a different name? Had he been the victim of foul play? Had he succumbed to addiction? They had no answers. Now they know Charles Howard Wallace died sometime between fall 1974 and January 1977. His body ended up in a farm field in Lee County, Arkansas, over 100 miles from where he was last seen in Memphis. But how did he get there? How did he die? And why was he buried in that field? The Arkansas State Police Cold Case Unit is still investigating. They're appealing to the public for information. If you were in Lee County, Arkansas between 1974 and 1977, if you remember seeing anything unusual in that farm field near Highway 79, if you have any information about Charles Howard Wallace or what might have happened to him, they need to hear from you. Michael Vogan, Director of Case Management for Othram Labs, explained the significance of cases like this. We took a lot of time to develop the technology that we have to apply to these cases, he said, and to be able to give some of this new information to investigators who do a great job. You never know what information will crack the case. Of course, the goal is to give them a name. And that's exactly what happened. Charles Howard Wallace has his name back. His family finally knows what happened to him, even if they don't yet know all the details of his death. He's no longer John Doe. He's a young man who struggled, who disappeared, who died far from home, and now his family can finally lay him to rest with dignity. Arkansas State Police Sergeant Crystal Rhodes spoke about the challenges of using genetic genealogy in cold cases. "This fantastic DNA testing is wonderful," she said, "but it also carries a pretty big price tag. We have to be very mindful of the cases that we choose because not every human remains has that specific DNA that can give us those answers. We've been really fortunate that we've identified these people. Their family no longer has to wonder whatever happened to them." For Charles Wallace's relatives, the identification brings both closure and renewed grief. They'd hoped Charles was alive somewhere, living a quiet life. Instead, he's been dead for nearly 50 years, lying in an Arkansas field while they search for him. But at least now they know. And in cold cases, knowledge, even painful knowledge, is a kind of justice. The circumstances surrounding Charles Wallace's death remain under investigation. Arkansas State Police are determined to find out how he died and why his body ended up in that field. The case is not closed. It's just been given new life through genetic genealogy. 5 cases, 5 families, 5 decades of waiting, and in 2025, 5 names restored. In Carl Matthew Bryant, 4 years old, beaten to death and left in a Virginia creek in 1972. Identified 53 years later through DNA extracted from millimeters of hair. Sheila Cummings, 23 years old, murdered by James Mitchell Schaffer in 1984, buried in his basement, unidentified for 40 years until her daughter found information online and reached out to detectives just days before her remains were scheduled for exhumation. Donna Oglive, 24 years old and 4 months pregnant, strangled in a Toronto parking lot in 1998. Her killer, Ronald Gordon Ackerman, arrested 26 years later at an airport, caught by the DNA he left behind. Carol Sue Skidmore, a wife and mother trying to save her marriage, murdered by her husband in 1977. Her body buried in a Florida forest for 45 years while her family searched. Finally brought home to Texas in 2025. Charles Howard Wallace, 21 years old, found in an Arkansas farm field in 1977. Unidentified for 48 years. Finally given his name back, though the mystery of his death continues. These aren't just statistics. These are people. Children who never got to grow up. Mothers who never got to raise their kids. Young adults whose lives were stolen. And families who waited generations for one word: closure. What do all these cases have in common? Time didn't solve them. Traditional detective work didn't solve them. What solved them was genetic genealogy, a technology that didn't exist when most of these crimes occurred. In 1972, when Carl Bryant was murdered, DNA profiling was science fiction. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, wouldn't launch until 1998. In forensic genetic genealogy, the process of using DNA to build family trees and identify distant relatives didn't become a viable investigative tool until the 2010s. But in 2025, these technologies are solving cases that were once considered unsolvable. Labs like Othram, Astra Forensics, and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement are extracting DNA from teeth, bones, and hair that have been stored in evidence rooms for decades. They're building profiles. They're uploading them to genealogy databases. They're finding relatives, second cousins, third cousins, people who have no idea they hold the key to solving a murder. Then genealogists take over. They build family trees, working backward through generations. They narrow down possibilities. They find names. And detectives follow those names to identification, closure, and sometimes justice. The technology is revolutionary, but it's also expensive and time-consuming. Every case requires careful selection. Every sample must be viable. Every analysis costs thousands of dollars. Law enforcement agencies have to prioritize. They have to choose which cases get the resources of genetic genealogy. But when it works, it's miraculous. Families who waited 50 years get answers. Victims get their names back. Killers who thought they'd gotten away with murder find themselves facing justice decades later. And the message is clear. If you committed a crime and left DNA behind, time is not on your side anymore. The evidence doesn't disappear. The DNA doesn't degrade beyond use. And one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe in 10 years, that DNA will lead investigators to your family tree, to your relatives, to you. For the families in these 5 cases, 2025 was the year their waiting finally ended. Carl Bryant's cousins can visit his grave and say his real name. Sheila Cummings' daughters finally know what happened to their mother. Donna Oglive's child will see their mother's killer face trial. Carol Skidmore's brother can lay his sister to rest in Texas. Charles Wallace's relatives finally have closure, even if the full story of his death remains a mystery. These cases prove that no matter how much time passes, the truth is written into our very bones. It waits patiently in evidence rooms, in unmarked graves, in the DNA preserved in teeth and hair and tissue. It waits for science to catch up. It waits for genealogists to build the family trees. It waits for detectives to make the connections. And when that moment comes, when the identification is confirmed, when the name is finally spoken aloud after decades of silence, it's more than just closing a case. It's restoring dignity. It's honoring the dead. It's giving families the one thing they've been praying for, the truth. If you have information about any unsolved case, any murder, any disappearance, any unidentified remains, please contact your local law enforcement. Technology has changed. Cases that seemed unsolvable in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s can be solved today. Your information, combined with genetic genealogy, might be the key that finally brings someone home. Because in 2025, we learned something powerful. Time doesn't erase the truth, it only delays it. And genetic genealogy is finally letting the truth speak. This has been Criminal Minds Archives. Thank you for watching. And remember, no case is ever truly cold. It's just waiting for the right technology, the right detective, and the right moment to finally be solved.